Hello and welcome back to the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One. It is Sunday, March 19th, 2023. Mark Daly here, flying solo. And because Hamilton's off doing Hamilton things with the family tonight, that's why I'm mixing it up a little bit, going back to our original intro music, just to let you know that this isn't quite our usual show. Anyways, we have another race to talk about. The Saudi Arabian Grand Prix 2023 edition went down earlier today, and we'll talk about that tonight, and we'll talk about fantasy and a whole bunch of other stuff. A shout out to Rocky checking in on the live stream on YouTube. Rocky, how's it going, my man? Yes, as I said, just me tonight flying solo. So Rocky, if you want to, you can kind of slide in and you can be like my virtual co-host if you're cool with that. Anyways, yeah, Saudi Arabia went down, third running of Jeddah, and it seems like we've been here like a million times already. First time in 2021, 2022, and 2023. Of course, last year in 2021, there was only a couple of months between them because we saw at the end of the 21 season. Second race, round two of last year, same as this year. But I don't know, maybe it's just me. Doesn't feel like 12 months have passed since we were at Jeddah last year. But let's not get into that because that also is an indication of like my advancing age. Or at least it feels like it's ticking up more and more, which of course it is every year. Anyhow, before we get into it, let's take a look at what's happening in our fantasy league, the Scuderia F1 Podcast Super League 2023. Good news for Scuderia Westwood F1, which is my team, moved up almost 200 places over, well, not quite 200 places, went from 599 to 414 for this week. So had some good showings, making some moves here in my team, made some changes. So hopefully we'll see things, for at least from my point of view. I mean, I can't win the grand prize of the autographed Max helmet, but sure, I'm going to try and, at least for bragging rights, I have to appear like I know what I'm doing, I hope. We'll see about that. Anyways, top five: Bengals Bubs with 706 points, Audi F1 team 693, Aston Gives You Wings 680, Charles CL also with 680, and Free Ukraine 680, and Green Bull Romeo. A lot of to unpack in that one. Anyways, that's the top six. Anyhow, I had to throw in Green Bull Romeo because that is just kind of, like I say, there's a lot going on there. Anyhow, where do we want to start with this one? Let's go over the race classification of the top 10, and then we can break down which was a lot of eventful things happening on the streets of Jeddah this weekend. Maybe not for all the reasons that we wanted to. Anyways, winning this year, Sergio Perez, you didn't hear that incorrectly. Checo winning of just about 5.5 seconds ahead of his teammate, Max Verstappen. Fernando Alonso, who finished on the podium, then off the podium, and then back on the podium for his 100th time in his Formula One career, only the sixth Formula One driver to do so. George Russell was the first of the two Mercedes drivers home in P4, followed by his teammate Lewis Hamilton in P5. Then we have a pair of Ferraris in 6 and 7 with Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc. Then a pair of Alpines led by Esteban Ocon and then Pierre Gasly. Gasly scoring new points for his new team in only his second race out. And then Kevin Magnussen scoring a P10 for Haas. And there you go on that one. So I guess we could now all of a sudden, let's go over the Drivers' Championship, because this will frame a lot of what we're going to talk about. Max Verstappen leading his Red Bull teammate now by a single point. Max with 44 points. Sergio Perez with 43 points. Fernando Alonso, though you did not hear this incorrectly, and no, it is not 2006 or thereabouts. Anyways, Nando third in the Drivers' Championship, currently with 30 points, 10 points ahead of his countryman, Carlos Sainz from Ferrari, who also has 20, or who has 20 points, pardon me. Lewis Hamilton is fifth in the Drivers' Championship with 20 points. And just for the sake of it, George Russell is only 2 points behind his Mercedes teammate with 18 points after two races. Top five in the constructors: Red Bull with 87, Aston Martin with 38, Mercedes also with 38, Ferrari with 26, and then Alpine rounding out the top five in the constructors with 5 points. So, yes, there were plenty of things to talk about this weekend, and let's just dive right into it, because the big saga, of course, was Fernando Alonso finishing third in the race today, but only to have his podium yanked away from him for a stop and go penalty infraction where the stewards had judged or the fact that the jack had been touching the car while he was serving that 5 second stop penalty for that he was awarded or penalized. I guess stop and go penalty isn't awarded. You were penalized with after he lined up a little bit too far to the left of his grid space at the start there, and it was really funny, right? Because Fernando. He knew that he got the penalty, got communicated to him over race radio, didn't really fight about it. I guess he knew it was coming. And anyways, at about lap 18 or thereabouts, lap 20, whatever it was, we had a safety car after Lance Stroll. His car let go on him, and he had to pull off to the side of the track, which that was a bit of a strange one too, because it looked like he was well off the track, tried to pull in where there was a bit of an escape road, so none of the marshals had to go out onto the track. Only a bit of the rear end of the car was protruding. However, they did decide that it was enough of a safety issue and better to, of course, always to err on the side of caution rather than putting marshals out into the potential danger, right? So no issues there. Anyways, Fernando goes in as well as many other drivers did, of course, like you see during safety car periods, served his 5 second penalty, went out, and nobody ever thought anything more of it. We figured that this was all said and done, and we're going to go on with the rest of the race, and let's see if Fernando is going to catch up to the Red Bulls, which of course he never was going to, nor was anyone else, because they were literally blowing the bodywork off of everyone as they cut through the field, or especially Max. I mean, Checo, once he got out in front and passed Fernando, what a move Fernando put on Checo at the start of the race there to take the lead, although just for a brief amount of time. Anyways, we went on. We had a race. We had a lot of things going on, and we didn't really hear anything until a couple laps from the end when all of a sudden we hear over George Russell's radio from the pit wall that, you know, George, pick it up. Fernando might be penalized again, and you want to close that gap. Fernando gets the same sort of message again at the end. I think when Fernando crossed the finish line, I think that he had about 5 seconds, 5.1 seconds between himself and George Russell. Anyways, he goes into Parc Fermé. He does the interviews. He goes up onto the podium, and then shortly thereafter, gets the news that he has been found if with an infraction of the team working on the car due to the fact that the jack stand was underneath the back of the car within that 5 seconds, and technically that's working on the car. So anyways, George gets the P3, and he goes off to do all the media commitments and things like that, only a couple hours later to have it reinstated in Fernando's favor after the Aston Martin had appealed it with video footage of 6 or 7 other incidents where other teams had done exactly the same thing and weren't penalized it, and then the penalty was reversed again. So Fernando was indeed eventually awarded the P3, which it was funny because I was out. I watched the race, watched all the post race stuff, had a bunch of stuff to do. Well, I was waiting to hear from Hammy and see what time we were going to do the podcast and all that stuff before I found out I was flying solo. Anyways, that's a bit of a tangent, don't need to go down. I was out. I decided to stop off, grab some coffee, sitting in the drive-through waiting to pick up my Java, and I'm kind of scrolling through Twitter. I wasn't be distracted driver, I guess. I was in the drive-through, so don't judge me. Anyhow, I see that Fernando had tweeted about an hour previously something about the 100th podium, the P3, and I'm just like, hey, Fernando, didn't you hear? You lost the P3, or is this kind of like one of these kind of like critical tweets, kind of like, it technic, you took it away from me, but it still counts in my mind kind of thing. But, joke was on me, of course. Got home and I'm like, I'm starting to lose track of what's going on. Anyways, what I found interesting about it was apparently that despite nothing getting flagged by the track official that was there to monitor it during the pit stop itself, it was reviewed by something called the ROC, the Remote Operations Center, which is fairly similar to like we see in other sports where we have like a video replay official. So I thought, okay, that this is starting to make a little bit of sense. But where I found a little bit confusing, right, is if there was somebody in the pits watching to make sure, and they got a stopwatch or whatever it is, however they're monitoring him, there was nothing flagged right away, because usually we'll see something come up on the television feed. The commentators will see something official saying, car number 14 under investigation, and then there'll be a reason, touching, working on the car within 5 seconds, stop go penalty, whatever it might be. And, away we go. But so when the first time we hear this, like I say, it was on George Russell's race radio, that was a little bit strange. But if it was going to be an issue, it was always going to be an issue, like immediately right during the pit stop or immediately thereafter. And then it didn't really transpire too much later on. And I was on Tim Haraini's podcast earlier, and I said to him, this is like in basketball at the end of the game. The opposing coach goes up to the referee and says, hey, remember that foul you didn't call way back in the first quarter? I think we need to go back and take a look at that. Or in football, the coach throwing the challenge flag 3 plays after a missed PI call or something like that. You can't go back and do it. So it looks really, really strange. And Rocky, by the way, I agree. Rock sounds way cooler than VAR. And I'm not going with ROC. I'm going with Rock. Rock sounds actually pretty cool for the remote operations center or whatever it is. Anyhow, I just thought that the timing was strange. If it was going to be an issue, why did it take them so long to do it? And the the whole reaction I had to it is like, I felt, haven't we learned anything? And I say we as in the royal we, the collective we, when I'm really referring to Formula One. Hasn't Formula One learned anything after 2021 and Abu Dhabi and all that? It just would have thought that these sort of things would get sorted out. And I agree that obviously Formula One isn't like basketball. It isn't like football and all these other sports that have, video replay as well. And in Formula One, of course, is different than a lot of other racing series. Completely understand that. Totally understand that. But there has to be some sort of limit to it. I mean, it just seems kind of strange that nothing was immediately identified during the pit stop or immediately thereafter. Why does it take so long, especially when we were at lap 20 out of 30 or 50 or whatever it was this afternoon? There's still plenty of time. And if it's going to be an issue, they should have immediately said that car number 14 under investigation because reasons, right? And not have all these shenanigans afterwards. And I think that obviously we need some clarity, right? If Aston Martin found examples of other teams doing exactly the same thing that have happened in other instances where a team has been awarded a penalty for whatever reasons that they did that, then of course there's a precedent set. As long they didn't have like wheel guns engaged and hands on tires and stuff like that. But if the jack stand was underneath the car but it wasn't whatever Aston Martin did today was the same as these previous 7 examples they managed to dig up, then of course you can enforce it without there have been a more recent directive from the FIA saying this is what you can and cannot do, because there's obviously a loophole in there. There's a gray area that needs to be closed. Some sort of directive needs to be issued, because I feel like now this seems to be like this conversation we had 2 years ago with the application of track limits, right? It seemed that they weren't always consistently applying the track limits. It's just like track limits is defined as this, and this is what's going to be from race 1 to race 23 or whatever, and there's not these moving goalposts in between. Anyways, long story short, I'm glad that Fernando was able to keep the P3. Obviously, 100 podiums in his Formula One career is an amazing achievement. He's only the 6th driver in the history of Formula One in, what is it now, 75, 70 years, whatever it is now, that we've had championships in the past. I mean, it is a phenomenal achievement. So congratulations to him. Just Formula One, let's get it sorted out. Let's close these loopholes, because it is a credibility issue. It doesn't make you guys look good, and certainly it can't go on in the future. Again, I feel like we've had this conversation before, right? All right, moving along. Let's. I actually want to jump into the mailbag, or to the tweets, just get some of your thoughts, and just talk about some of the different issues. Tweet from Robert Carnell was, watch the race tonight without seeing spoilers, then hopped online, saw the headline about the flip-flop penalty stuff. LOL. Nothing further to add. Robert, I think you nailed it. Next one comes from our good friend Michelle Gonzalez at Mish310, and her tweet is, who finishes higher if you had to bet? Aston, remember the second driver's Lance, or Ferrari after 23 races? Honestly, at this point, I'm putting my money on Aston Martin. I think that 2 races in, I think they look good. I mean, remember their second driver's Lance. Michelle, are you throwing shade at Lance Stroll, you realize that Mark Hamilton and myself, we're probably the only two inhabitants on Lance Stroll Island. I admit, after the last couple of races, we've had a couple people poking around, maybe staying around for lunch. Nobody's put a down payment or a deposit on a new place yet, but we have hopes. Anyhow, I think that Lance has looked pretty good so far this year. He had a mechanical issue that forced him out today after it was 18 or 20 laps that instigated the whole safety car thing. And I think he looked pretty good. And I think that had he not gone out today, that he certainly would have scored points. And I would have been surprised if Lance had brought home that Aston Martin in P4. So we'd have seen the two Red Bulls, two Aston Martins, or at least he would have been mixed up in there with the two Mercedes drivers. Would he have had more than George and Lewis? I think he probably would have. Mercedes, obviously better than Ferrari today, but I think there's still a little bit of a delta. There's still a gap between Aston Martin and Mercedes, but Aston Martin to Ferrari, absolutely. Tim and I talked about this on his podcast earlier. That one of the questions that came in was, "Is Ferrari now the top fourth team on the Formula One grid?" And I think that they absolutely are. Red Bull, no doubt, this is the best class of the field by far. They got one of the best drivers, obviously, in Max, double world champion, reigning world champion. Sergio Perez has proven that he's no pushover as well. And, obviously winning today, and has got now, what was it, five wins to his resume in Formula One. So certainly not to be, don't turn your nose up at Sergio. He can certainly get the job done. And he's looked pretty good so far this season. Certainly did very well last year as well. But Ferrari, you can't fault anything that either Charles or Carlos did today. They just didn't have the speed. They just didn't have the performance. But the one thing I will give them is the fact that we're not sitting here, either laughing or criticizing or crying or screaming, depending, where your allegiance lies and whether or not you're a Ferrari fan or not. At least for the most part, the language and the communications and the decisions being made in the pits and on the pit wall aren't as unusual or strange or downright bizarre as we've seen over the past couple of years. So I'm going to chalk that up to Fred Vasseur, the new team principal, and I think that any changes that we're going to see with Ferrari under Fred Vasseur are going to be things like that. I know there was the incident between Charles and his race engineer Xavi during the race, because he was giving him advice, telling him, "Oh, you can do this and this between the safety car lines." And an exasperated Charles said something that, "Oh, I need to know these things. Come on," and getting quite agitated and irritated with his engineer. So that was obviously a bit of a disconnect there. But for the most part, at least through two races, we've seen some better things. Now, we're not going to see Fred Vasseur's fingerprints and his influence on the car in any time in the short term, right? He didn't come in until halfway through the off season. The car for 2023 was basically all done and finished and ready to hit the road at that point. So his influence on the build and design of a car is not going to be seen until this year or until next year, or at least when it comes to like what upgrades and what in season improvements are we going to see with the Ferrari. And are they really going to be able to close that gap to Mercedes? Are they going to be able to close that gap to Aston Martin? Let's face it, they're not going to close that gap to Red Bull. At this point, I don't know if anybody can gap or close that gap to Red Bull. But anyways, it is what it is. Certainly, I think that go back to the original question, Michelle, Aston Martin 100% is going to finish ahead of Ferrari at the end of the season. Anyways, I'm going to take a quick break here. Got a couple more tweets I want to jump into. Do so in just a moment. So don't go away. We'll be back in just a moment. All right, welcome back to the podcast, and a big hello to Connie Stewart, who's checking in on the live stream on YouTube. And Connie's comment is, we should have a bet on the over-under of how many FIA blunders there are this year. So yes, I guess that is obviously going to be a thing. And well, you don't count on me or to put money in, because number one, I'm terribly cheap, but for bragging rights, we should definitely get some some sort of wager going. And I kind of hate to have to go there, but I completely understand your sentiments, Connie. I feel like that this is probably overdue, and I know this is like cynical F1 fans checking in and saying these things, but there's not a lot of confidence when it comes to this sort of stuff. And I really thought that we'd move beyond this. I mean, the other thing I didn't mention before the break when I was talking about the whole Fernando thing was 2 weeks ago in Bahrain. I mean, they were all over Esteban Ocon. What did he get at the end? Was it 3 penalties, 4 penalties? I lost track at one point because obviously he was awarded a 5 second stop go penalty for lining up incorrectly in his pit box, or sorry, grid spot. I mean, compared to Fernando, who was a little bit too far back, Esteban lined up a little bit too far forward, and then he went in. He didn't serve the 5 second penalty correctly. Then he got a penalty for speeding in the pit lane. Seemed like he got a penalty for literally everything under the sun 2 weeks ago. But the thing is that when they had determined that he hadn't served his 5 second penalty correctly, that came down really quickly, as did all the other penalties he was awarded with. There wasn't like this waiting for 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever it might be, before they came back and said something that that should really be dealt with a lot quicker. Anyways, going back to Twitter now, wanted to talk about a couple of things here for sport, and this one comes from Fred Couture. It says, for a sport where millimeters can be the difference between win or bust, how can a second Grand Prix in a row a team screw up a pit stop penalty? Can nobody learn from this mistake? And also, someone needs to tell Max to be gracious when he finishes second. He looked like he was at a funeral. That's actually a good observation, Fred, because we were talking about that too. My wife said too, doesn't Max ever look happy if he doesn't finish second, or sorry, finish first? And the one thing I said is, well, he looks kind of happy. He's not ecstatic, but I think this sort of reinforces the fact that the Verstappens, they don't look happy at all if they don't win. And I'm going to include his dad in that, because didn't you guys find it interesting that after the race in the pits, when everybody was coming to celebrate around the podium, Sergio literally goes and high fives and hugs everybody in that little enclosure, including a lot of the people from Aston Martin, which he knows obviously very well from the time that he was with the team when it was Racing Point, and there before that as Force India, and they looked just as happy for him as Red Bull did. So I thought that was really cool to see. And then he goes around, he's high-fiving and hugging his own teammates and everything. And kind of in between the two groups of Red Bull personnel was Jos Verstappen. And I mean, if looks could kill, right? Oh my God, the icy stare in his eyes and the fact that he didn't move, that to me said volumes. I think that on the surface, I think they're doing a pretty good job. That at least it gives appearances that there's harmony in this team, but I wouldn't be surprised that below the surface there's something a little bit more, because the way that Jos was unflinching and obviously didn't want to high five. I mean, he didn't crack a smile or anything. He just looked really, really upset. Kind of makes me wonder, is there still bad blood on the Verstappen side of the garage compared to the versus the Perez side of the garage, going back to that alleged Sergio crashing on accident / on purpose at Monaco last year? Because I think we were all really shocked last year when we heard Max's tirade at the end of the Brazilian Grand Prix, and the fact he did no favors to Sergio that day, and all he knows why, you guys know why, and that whole saga, which we don't have to get into. So I think that there's there might be something to that. But I was thinking too, and I thought about this quite a bit this afternoon, and I often was thinking to myself, I don't think it gets to the point this season that that these two are legitimately fighting for the world championship. I think that if Max got pretty close to passing Sergio today, I think he gets that that message in over race radio, just stay where you are, team orders kind of thing. Let Sergio take this one home, because let's face it, if Max didn't have that drive shaft issue in qualifying that made him start as far back as he did, Max takes pole in this race. And by extension of that, Max, unless he has another mechanical issue, is going to win this race. I mean, he rarely puts a wheel wrong. I mean, he's a very precise driver. He's very accurate, and like all the really great drivers in Formula One, he rarely makes mistakes of something that he does on his own, right? We don't see guys like Lewis do that, and all the great drivers, they rarely put a wheel wrong. So I think that if Max starts pole, if he's leading this race, that's his race to win. But I think on the balance of what happened over the weekend, you give this one to Sergio. In a couple of weeks, we start with a fresh race and we go off to a new track and all that sort of stuff. And the slate is wiped clean. And I just don't see it going on and on over the long term, because I don't think that's like a healthy thing to do. Because I think, like, compared to Ferrari, do we actually know yet at Ferrari if they've made that decision? Is Charles the number one, or are we just making that assumption, or are we just kind of going on the assumption that it's been for the last couple of years, operating under former team principal Mattia Bonotto, that you have Charles and Carlos, who are co number ones, which in my mind, in experience in Formula One, never typically works. Anyways, going back to Red Bull, I can't see it to the point where they would let them compete for the Formula One World Championship. I think that, what Max and his team, like, Team Verstappen, that is, and his dad and his management, they would throw a lot of pressure on Red Bull not to let that happen. Besides, would you really want that dynamic in the garage next year? That if you get into close situations again, then you have Max, who's won 2 championships, and theoretically Sergio winning a championship this year, which I don't think is going to happen. It could come down to that. It's just like, well, they could be having that conversation, and Sergio says, well, Christian, that's all well and good, but I'm reigning world champion. Shouldn't I be the one getting being the preference of strategy and all that, all the track position, whatever it might be, rather than Max? Of course not. This is a team that has been built around Max. This is a team that's for Max. This is a car that's built around Max. And I just still, I see that if it came to unfold that, and Sergio won this and beat Max, Sergio versus Max on the track, I just don't see that that would be a good dynamic that they would want. I mean, could it get as nasty as Rosberg versus Hamilton? I don't think so, but who knows, right? A lot we saw the tip of the iceberg, I think, in Brazil, and some of the things that came out in social media afterwards, interestingly enough from Verstappen's mother, right? So I think there's a lot that we're not seeing, a lot of things that we aren't hearing, and I just don't think that Red Bull camp is maybe as sunny as it might look on the surface. Anyways, next one comes from a good friend of the show, Joe Santucci at ATX Santucci. And Joe's comment is, how disgusted are you by Fernando's podium be given to George post-race, post-celebration? With the gif that that he included was, I am disgusted. Yeah, I thought it was a bad look for Formula One, and it kind of goes back to that discussion that we had, first of all, a couple of years ago. It kind of started low key, right, when we were just like, oh, what is the application? What is with the inconsistency with, like, applying track limits? Excuse me, and things like that, and the inconsistency there. And of course, that reached a crescendo after Abu Dhabi in 21, and rightly so. Last year, it wasn't such an issue at times, but it's come back in a way that my immediate reaction was, I was annoyed. I was frustrated. I'm just like, this is not a good look for Formula One. It really kind of gives it a Bush League look. So, guys, you really need to go and take a look and try and close these loopholes. I mean, Aston Martin's appeal, I think, was legit. I think that they obviously found material that consolidated and really solidified their arguments, and that's that's their prerogative. That's their right to do so, because if other teams were doing the exact same thing and they never penalized for it, then their argument rightly should be, why should we? But the way that it was handled, the way that they took it away, and obviously Joe sent me this tweet before he heard that it was given back to Fernando. I mean, this whole flip floppy stuff was just, it was just not a good luck. So yeah, I'm totally with you on this one. The last one comes from Ray in SD. I'm not sure if that's Ray in San Diego or Ray in South Dakota or Ray in South Denver, whatever SD is. Glad to have you on board, Ray, and thanks for the tweet. And which he says, disappointed lack of competition or competition and racing. Also, why is F1 the only series in which no one defends race position? Because it is, quote unquote, it's not their race. And we did see that, right? A number of cars, especially. And wasn't that incredible, just watching the way that Max carved his way through the field? it was just absolutely incredible the way that he blew by the Ferraris, blew by the Mercedes, and even Fernando wasn't able to to put up too much of a fight. But we saw it, especially when you see cars on different strategies and different tire compounds and things like that. Sometimes they don't put up a fight with the car that's faster with them because they're not fighting with them because they realize that their battle is with the car that's in front of them, which the faster car that just overtook them is probably going to overtake them, or the cars behind them because they're on similar strategies. I agree. That is a little bit frustrating sometimes to watch when, they just kind of like let them go by. It's just like, okay, well, why are you not making it more difficult for them, right? I mean, to kind of put it into context with other sports, it's like in football, for example, you have a team that's on the cusp of them getting a wild card or making the playoffs or whatever it is, and they come up against a team that's like 2-15 or 3-14, whatever it is. They have had a horrible, season, but that's sometimes the fun of watching the NFL or football or any sport, right? Is that when you get down to these crucial times of the season, that some of these teams that have struggled, have horrible seasons, their playoffs, their Super Bowl, whatever it might be, all of a sudden becomes to play that spoiler and to try to throw a wrench into this other team's, because you don't always get teams that kind of like roll over. I know that's maybe not the greatest comparison or analogy, but you kind of get what I'm saying, right? It's just like, yeah, maybe that car isn't the car that that you're going to be racing with for position at the end of the race, but at least try and put up a bit of a fight that, just don't let them, because they got DRS or whatever it might be, just to blow by you on the track and that's it. At least try and defend that position. Try and slow them down for as long as you can, even if it's half a lap, maybe it's 2 laps, 3 laps, because you know what about pride? What about trying to stay as long in front and as high as you are? Because who's to say, maybe that car, you can defend that position until the end of the race. You never know, right? However, it was Jerry Blaney checked in to answer to Ray's tweet and said 100% for the third race. Everyone backed off and held station, even Max. And why didn't Lewis go after George? Time for Lewis to move on. Ooh, that's an interesting take right there. We did see 2 weeks ago it was Lewis that finished in front of George at Bahrain, and then vice versa this afternoon. Lewis, he kind of passive aggressively threw the team under the bus, say that he wasn't too happy about the car after the Bahrain Grand Prix. He kind of walked it back earlier this week in the media day at Jeddah, but I don't know. Is it time for Lewis to move on? I don't think so, not yet. Certainly, I think Lewis has a lot to give to the sport and to give to the team, and this is not a great car. This is, you could tell that Lewis wasn't really pushing it this afternoon, whereas George was felt a little bit more, pushing it harder than some of the other drivers were. But you could even tell that Lewis wasn't happy with it. He did say that he wasn't happy with especially the hard compound tires early in the race. And that was another interesting thing, just to kind of bring it back to Fernando. And obviously, the Red Bull is the class of the field, but the reason why I think that the Aston Martin is the second best car on the track right now was the fact that we heard, and this was kind of like one of those little snippets of race radio that kind of like got dropped in there, when after Fernando had that now infamous pit stop, when he switched onto the hard tires, he said something to the fact, "I'm really liking how these tires feel," and I thought that was really interesting because other cars didn't do as well on the hard tires. They're kind of taking longer to get them up to temperature, get into that sweet spot, get into the window where those tires perform optimally. But Fernando, and you can tell, like when Fernando is, he wears his emotions on his sleeve, right? When he's unhappy about something, he'll say it. He'll get on the radio, but you can tell there's a real a real edge to his voice. You can tell he's irritated or upset about something. But when I heard that, to me, it sounded like he was also very satisfied with the way that, not only were the tires working well, but you could just tell he was satisfied. He was in the groove and the car was doing well. He did say, later on that, there was, it wasn't going to be enough to catch the Red Bulls, but, nobody can really catch the Red Bulls at the moment. Okay, well, let's move along. Let's talk about a couple of more things here before we shut it down. don't think I can go the usual 90 minutes between the by myself, what I can with Mark Hamilton. But Ferrari again, I think it was just really interesting to see how slow they were compared to everyone else. But we'll have to wait and see. I'm just going to go back here to the race results here, and just there was a couple other different ones, different storylines. I just wanted to address briefly before I sign off for the evening in a few minutes. So as I said earlier, we saw the two Alpines of Esteban Ocon, Pierre Gasly. They came home in P8 and 9, which I think was a good result for them. And after the restart, they came very close to maybe touching, getting a little bit closer than what was comfortable, and that really would have put the theory to test that both of these guys claim that they're getting along, and they're everything that any bad blood that there was between them was that was has been put well to rest. So actually, I was a little bit mistaken. I said earlier in the broadcast that this was Pierre Gasly's second race and the first time that he scored points. I got that mixed up. Last week or 2 weeks ago, he did score points. He got a P9. I was, for some silly reason, I got him mixed up with Esteban Ocon. I thought he got those points, but of course Esteban, he had that horrible race and actually was a DNF in the end. So Pierre Gasly, 2 races in to his Alpine career, scored points twice, and then P8 for Esteban this weekend. I think that was right where they needed to be, and I think that obviously this is a work in progress, but we'll see. Are they going to be able to move up? Certainly, I think that what was interesting this afternoon was, even though that there was quite a distance between them and the race leaders, was that even though they finished P8 and 9, when you look where Charles Leclerc was finishing P7, which also was a fairly good recovery drive from him. I mean, it was only 6 points, but still, he was never going to catch Carlos Sainz. Sainz was never going to catch up to the Mercedes, and certainly he was never going to have a chance to catch the two Ferrari, or sorry, the two Aston Martins until Lance dropped out, and certainly nobody, regardless of who they are, going to catch the Red Bulls at the moment. Anyways, so Charles, he finishes ahead of the two Alpines, but Esteban was only about 8 or 9 seconds behind, which I know was a fair distance, but there was only 2 seconds or so between Esteban and his teammates, so that looked pretty good. K-Mag finishing P10, getting a point for Haas this weekend, and I'm liking the dynamic I'm seeing between Nico Hulkenberg and Kevin Magnussen. Hulk, he finished out the points in P10. The two Hasses were separated by Yuki Tsunoda, which I thought was one of the more humorous moments during the broadcast, when they broadcast or played like his somewhat surprised reaction to being passed by K-Mag into turn one. And K-Mag, boy, did he ever pick that point to pass Yuki at absolute perfection, because he went really deep into that little left right chicane, that little flick left right into turn 1 and 2, and managed to keep it on the track. Didn't exceed track limits and go into a little runoff area and cut the corner and then have to give it back. So full marks to him for keeping that between the white lines and taking home a point for that. But the point is that I like with Magnussen and Hulkenberg is that I think that Gunther Steiner has seen, or they believe that this Haas is a car that is capable of delivering points and points finishes, and a large reason why Mick Schumacher didn't come back this year, was replaced by Nico Hulkenberg, is that they want to put this car into the hands of drivers that are capable to score points, hopefully from their point of view, on a more regular basis. Whether or not Magnussen and Hulkenberg can do that remains to be seen. But Hulkenberg, I think he's done good in the first couple of races. Of course, he's been a part-time fill-in driver for the last year or so. We've only really seen him filling in at Aston Martin and some other teams as a replacement driver especially during the COVID era, when guys would test positive, wouldn't be able to race. And we saw Hulkenberg kind of like drop in a couple of times. Of course, he's going to need the time to fully get reacclimatized with Formula One, get his conditioning back. But the first couple of races have been fairly decent from Kevin Magnussen as well. And Valtteri Bottas, whew, boy, what happened to Valtteri today? He was down in P18. He was the only car that was lapped on the streets of Jeddah this afternoon. The only two cars that weren't classified were Lance Stroll, who retired in lap 16, and then Alex Albon in the Williams, who retired in lap 27 after his brakes failed. And talk about a track where you don't want to have your brakes fail. Jeddah would certainly be the one, but Bottas really, not really there. And Joe Guan Yu was kind of mixing it up in that group that included himself, Nick de Vries, Oscar Piastri, Logan Sargent, Lando Norris. I know that was the back of the grid, but that was some exciting racing that I'm sure we all were craving to see higher up the race order with the big names. But unfortunately, we didn't see it. But even though it finished P13, I thought Joe looked especially racy today, which is good to see. You can tell now that he's a guy that's got a year of Formula One under his belt. And I thought he looked a lot more, a lot more comfortable mixing it up, try either having to defend a position or trying to overtake. So that was good to see. Logan Sargent finished P16, so obviously not as good as his debut a couple of weeks ago, in which he finished P12 in Bahrain, only just out of the points, which was 2 places behind Alex Albon, who got a point in that race. But he looked good, right? I thought that he was looked comfortable out there fighting for a position with De Vries, with Joe, with the McLaren drivers. So that was good fun to see. But then also equally as interesting was watching the two McLaren drivers. Boy, Mark and I talked about it on the weekly show a couple of days ago that that the wheels have fallen off the McLaren hype machine. Boy, have they ever. I mean, I know that Zach Brown was saying that, this is not going to be a good start to the season, and that the potential in this car is not going to be unlocked until a number of races from now, until we can start getting some upgrades on the car, some improvements on the car. And hopefully these are magical improvements, because if you're a McLaren fan, you're not seeing a lot right now to really be excited about. And Lando was actually told to move out of the way of Piastri finished today. Of course, he didn't finish in Bahrain a couple of weeks ago, had a DNF because of a mechanical problem. Lando had those problems with what was it, the hydraulics or pneumatics, whatever it was, and went in for 4, 5, 6 pit stops in Bahrain, which was obviously disappointing in his weekend. But Piastri, he's got to prove that he deserves that seat, because he's a guy that, I mean, I don't think it's an overstatement to say that there was controversy in the way that he got that McLaren seat at the expense of Danny Ricciardo, because there was that whole sort of saga, and then the Twitter denial that after Alpine announced that Piastri was going to be contracted to them, would be driving for them in 23, and he rebuffed them and denied it pretty quick. So he has to prove that he deserves that seat, and I think today he certainly did that. Now, talking about Danny Ricciardo fan, I hate to say this, but after 2 races, is anybody saying we missed Danny Ricciardo? I'm not hearing it right now, and I'm a guy that really enjoyed watching Danny Ricciardo during his time in Formula One. But that was the thing, right? Is before the start of the season, Christian Horner was saying, basically, he kind of threw that challenge out there to Sergio Perez, and basically said, well, if you're not going to get the job done, we got Danny Ricciardo, and I'm parsing and paraphrasing here, of course. Danny Ricciardo's waiting in the wings and is more than willing and capable to take your seat if you don't need it. But after 2 races, I don't think Checo's feeling nervous right now, and I don't think that Ricciardo is really missed by too many. Of course, we all miss him for his sense of humor, his personality, and all those things. But after the couple of last couple of years, and the way that his career really started to slowly decline after he left to Red Bull at the end of the 2018 season, went to what was then Renault, and then before leaving to go to McLaren. Sorry, Danny, I don't think anybody misses you right now. And Checo certainly is not going to be losing any sleep. And Connie, I agree with you. Sorry, Danny, you aren't replacing Checo, was her comment. And, +1 on that, Connie, I agree with you 100%. Anyways, guys, I think that's it. Usually when Mark's here, we go for about 90 minutes. I'm looking at the timer right now and I see I'm at about 44 minutes. So just kind of like going from that kind of budget that based on just time alone, that's, I've almost reached my allotted 45 minutes. Plus, when Hammy's not here, it makes it a little bit difficult. And I'll be perfectly honest, I don't know how Hammy went for like an hour and 15 minutes on his own when I was away for work the other week, because I know I did this show on my own for a couple of years before Mark and I partnered up. But certainly, I'm going to give him, props and mad respect for what he did 2 weeks ago. So this is, I gave it the good old college try here tonight, and certainly appreciate all the messages and the tweets. And big shout out to Rocky and Connie and those of you that managed to drop by and hang out in the live stream tonight. Much appreciate you guys flying or sitting in the co-pilot seat tonight and keeping me focused. Much appreciated. Anyways, I'm going to park it there. I pulled into Park Fermé, and much like Max Verstappen, I'm going to kind of park it wherever the hell I want rather than where I should be. But fortunately, compared to Sergio Perez, I don't have my competitor's father standing, boring, icy daggers into my back as I sign off here. So I'm just going to leave it there. Thank you all for checking in tonight. Thank you all for downloading the show. If you want to get in touch, send us an email, scooterf1pod@gmail.com, or tweet us at scooterf1pod. If you like the show, leave us a rating review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you listen to it. It really does help us a lot and is a simple and quick way to support the show. Anyways, that's it for now. Have a great week, guys. Hammy and I will be back on Thursday night. Until then, have a great week. Bye for now.